I will give it to Rakesh Sharma sir. Welcome him once again.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So very quickly clarifying, yes, piracy is a crime, but it is not a crime when the filmmaker himself is asking you to pirate, because I am the copyright owner and I am giving you free permission to pirate. Copyleft, exactly. Not quite copyleft, because I was controlling the copyright outside India. My idea was that the film must become the largest circulating documentary in India. But I also need to recover my costs. I also need to earn a living. I also need to generate funds for my future work. And this is a dilemma that all filmmakers will have. So what I decided was that I will focus on earning my incomes from the so-called international market. But in India, I said I do not wish to earn an income. So once I made that decision, it was a no-brainer to actually start saying, free distribution of the film. Pirate and Circulate, the idea itself was born because when I applied for the censor certificate for the film, they decided to deny it any certificate. They said it was unsuitable for public exhibition because it threatened India's integrity. It was an attack on secularism. That it would affect relationship with other countries and so on. They threw the book at me. Everything which is in the Cinematograph Act, exemptions to Article 19.2, which is about freedom of expression. So, unlike my good friend Anand Patwardhan, who's also faced similar problems all the time, and you would have heard about it, his strategy has been to go to the court and go to the High Court, and then if necessary go to the Supreme Court and always get favorable orders. And the Supreme Court or the High Court of Bombay always ruled in favor of the filmmaker, always upholding free speech, freedom of expression. But to my mind, this was not the strategy I wanted to take, for a simple reason, that during that process, and that legal process takes anywhere between 1 to 3 years, so during that period, you're only able to screen your film in an underground manner, in friendly spaces, through activist groups. You can't do open screenings. So it serves the powers that be that banned the film or denied censor certificate, because the film is buried effectively for those 2 or 3 years. And my idea was very simple. You are trying to bury my film, I will make sure that the reverse happens. The more you try to crush my film, the more I will put it out in public and ensure that everybody watches it during those 3 years. So that is how Pirate and Circulate was born. Pirate and Circulate was only one component, and it was a very simple idea that I promised to give you a free copy of the film if you promise to make 10 copies of the film and circulate them further. And not just that, anybody you give it to, you have to ask them to pirate as well. So a chain of piracy, so to say. But in addition to that, and here I'll rewind a bit, I did have a stint in the corporate sector. I was in broadcasting. I had set up Star Plus in India. I launched Channel V. I relaunched Star Vijay. I trained Aaj Tak for news operations and live television, before they launched. So I had dealt with various aspects of broadcasting for 10 years before I returned to documentary filmmaking, which is my first love. So I decided that the marketing strategies that I had learnt during my corporate time, to adapt and adopt them for my own work, which was of a very different nature. So just to give you a small example, for our marketing of programs and channel, we used to tie up with media groups like Times of India or Times Music and so on. So I decided to do my own set of tie-ups. But my tie-ups were with Teesta Setalvad, who was bringing out Communalism Combat, a journal, which had about 2,000-3,000 subscribers. So I tied up with her and I said, I will give a free copy inserted in the magazine, a free disc, to all your subscribers. Teesta, of course, loved the idea. As a filmmaker, I was distributing it. But I said that in that journal, you have to publish a one page about what the film is and that it needs to be pirated by anybody who's getting it. Similarly, my good friend Yogendra Yadav was at that point bringing out a socialist journal in memory of Kishan Patnaik, the great socialist leader from Odisha, called Samayik Varta. So I also gave Samayik Varta free DVDs, free CDs at that point to insert in their magazine and send it to their subscribers. And I tied up with some radical left journals in UP and Bihar. Very small circulation, 500, 800, 1,000. But what that ensured was that a few thousand committed activists, committed anti-communal activists who were supporters of Teesta, Yogendra, other secular formations, they got these copies of the film, they got these DVDs with an appeal to screen the film and to pirate the film and to circulate it further. So this ensured that my film went to every corner of the country that I could not have possibly personally reached. Even if I had the best distributor in India at that point, even they couldn't have distributed the film so widely for me and to the most effective audience, to the most effective people, because these 4,000-5,000 activists who were reading all these journals and subscribing to them, they became my exhibitors, they became my distributors, and they were committed distributors because they were responding to an appeal directly from the filmmaker to circulate the film. The impact I understood only many years later. I mean, all these ideas that you have, you are hoping that it will work and something will happen. But only years later I began to understand how successful it became. Because I would meet people from, say, Cuttack or Dhinkanal in Odisha, and he would say that I had gone to Jharsuguda for a wedding where somebody gave me a copy of your film saying pirate and put it in Odisha, and I made 50 copies. They said only 10 copies, but I made 50. I would meet somebody from Patiala who would tell me that I had gone to Chandigarh for some function and an activist gave me a DVD and I made 20 copies. In Gujarat, I made a Gujarati version of the film, and those of you who don't know, I had a fight with the censor board. I refused to go to the court. I actually went to Ministry of I&B as a strategy and asked them to overturn the ruling because the censor board hadn't seen the film and I had documented it. Now, there is a provision in the Cinematograph Act which empowers the central government to do so, but it had never been invoked before. And I said to Jayapal Reddy, the minister at that point, that I understand that you will not do it. It was the UPA government by then. When I made the film, BJP was in power when I released it, but elections happened and then UPA came into power. So Mr. Jayapal Reddy, who became a very good friend and supporter through the months of negotiations that I had with him, kept saying to me that we cannot do this. And I said, I do not want you to do this. I want you to deny this request so I can go straight to the Supreme Court ordering the central government to do so. So he said to me, it's a brilliant strategy, but please don't push us in this corner. In the meanwhile, the censor board got wind of the fact that I am actually very maverick about my legal options and I'm not going to take the same route. So they convened us, Anupam Kher, who was a chairman of the censor board, one day gave me a call and said to me, "Yeah, Rakesh, I didn't know it was your film." And I started laughing and I said, "Of course, so tell me." And he said, "You should have just rung me up, you know me so well." And I told him that when you sent your proposals for TV serials to me at Star, you never rang me up because you respected that distance. So, I didn't ring you up and I didn't need a personal favor. I had come to the censor board for official certification. So he said, no, you apply again. And I said, I refuse to apply again because my stand is that you never saw the film and banned it. So I'm actually not just going to go to the Supreme Court about this. I'm going to sue you in consumer court. I'm going to, go for deficiency of service and so on and so forth. So he said, look, don't do this. Give me some time. And he kept pressurizing me to apply to the revising committee. I refused consistently. So the censor board actually organized a suo motu screening themselves, convened a special panel, for the censoring of the film, and they cleared the film without a single cut. And Anupam went on record that day itself with several newspapers saying it's an incredible testament of truth and so on and so forth. It's just another story that a week later he got sacked anyway. And then he started blaming me for his sacking. But, through this process, the parallel thing that kept happening was that the film kept getting screened all over the place. So I talked to you about the components, which is one, pirate and circulate, then tie-ups with activist journals and magazines. The third thing that I did was anywhere there was a server. And at that point there weren't too many servers, there weren't too many locations with servers. So IITs, IIMs, any universities with servers, advertising agencies, call centers, the film got uploaded on every server through some contact or the other, through some supporter or the other. With the result that even people in the corporate sector who don't normally access these films or normally don't watch these films, because there was so much buzz in the media about it, and I also ran a very successful media campaign, so there was a constant buzz. Even they got curious, so right from the corporate sector to advertising to even spaces like Infosys, Wipro, everywhere it was on the server. So the film got screened and seen widely. So as I said, to circle back, they decided to bury my film, and I made sure that the reverse happened.
Yesterday, when I was revisiting Final Solution, like earlier it was when a girl from Kerala, the earlier time, that time it is not I think that it is not believable actually that time. Now we are seeing it. So the schizophrenic nature of India is we all are experiencing it. So we have seen a very few things on screen actually, but you have experienced a lot while shooting this process. So I just want to hear more about the process and the experience of the shooting and what you have. Maybe you cannot say everything on.
Don't mind.
Okay.
Since I'm with both your students as well, this is going to be perhaps useful for all your students. I decided to, when riots happened in 92, 93 in Bombay, the nerve center was Jogeshwari East, which was only half a kilometer from where I was living in Andheri East. So, and as a student in Delhi, I had seen the 1984 riots. So at that point I had volunteered a little bit for a week or 10 days. In 93, when it happened in my own backyard, January of 93, I decided to give up whatever I was doing, all filmmaking assignments and media assignments, and ran a full-time relief camp in Jogeshwari East, the nerve center, for close to 10 months. When 2002 happened, I decided that I did not want to volunteer, do legal relief or do Red Cross type relief, getting blankets and food and kerosene stoves and temporary shelters and all that I had done in Bombay. That this time I wanted to use my skills as a filmmaker to intervene. Having made the decision, I went to Gujarat for the first time in end of March, a month after the carnage, the worst of the carnage. And I maybe shot for one day, and it just got too much for me. Because I'd seen riots before. I had filmed in UP during the riots in the late 1980s and during the early 90s. Meerut, Muradabad and so on. I had seen violence up close in Punjab because I had done filming for BBC at that point in Punjab during the height of the militancy. So I was no stranger to violence or bloodshed or rioting and so on. But what happened in Gujarat was not a mere riot. It was a carnage. It was a genocide. It was a state-sponsored pogrom. and state sponsorship at various levels. You had ministers sitting inside PCR, police control vans, directing not just the police officers, but providing information to their lower level leaders who were leading the mobs, saying we have cleared police from that area, now you can go attack. Okay. It was as horrible and as well organized. I mean, I'll just take a minute to talk about the anatomy of the violence itself. Uh, in any sort of organized riot, there are 3 or 4 layers of the mobs that go in. The core layer is the hardcore, violent, committed cadre led by the leadership, smaller level leadership. Now, then there's a second layer, which is a logistics support unit of the same formulation. So in this case, it was VHP and Bajrang Dal. This logistics support unit, organizes tempos and autos which are full of weapons, swords, guns if necessary, petrol cans to, or fuel, diesel to set fire, liquor packets for the people who are actually going to be doing the killing and the raping and the burning, food for them because they're going to get tired during the day, they will take a lunch break and then start killing again, water and so on. Then there's a third layer which is people who have been incited and gathered for the day. So just to rewind, in Bombay, in Jogeshwari, when the riot had happened, I was very interested in who did the killings. And the dead bodies that were found in that area were actually from Surat. So trucks of committed, foot soldiers had come from Surat to Bombay to fight. And if you remember yesterday in the film, there were many people who kept saying, "Hamare area ke nahi the, bahar se aaye the." We don't know who they were. But I mean, they were from adjoining districts or other parts of the city because very few people are comfortable burning homes or attacking their own neighbors unless they are, absolutely poisoned minds and monsters themselves. There's this third layer of people who've been organized for the day. And the fourth layer is, frankly speaking, just bystanders, people from around who are saying, okay, fine, this is happening, so this is my chance to maybe get hold of a TV set, maybe loot some things from the home, maybe just, all the rice and this and that and the other pulses and masalas that are there, I can loot it and take it to my home, the daily wages who are living around and so on. So these are the typical sort of 4 or 5 layers. Now I realized that all this actually was not just being organized by VHP and Bajrang Dal, but actually centrally being controlled by ministers all the way up to the CMO. And the CMO was being run by Amit Shah, who was at that point the Minister of State for Home in Gujarat government. Gujarat government was basically a 2-man show, like the current Indian government is. It was a Modi Shah show, even at that point. So reporting was happening all the way there. Just to again relate it back to those who saw the film yesterday, you might have noticed that eyewitnesses who were present with Ehsan Jafri in the same room talk about the fact that he called up the Chief Minister's office himself, okay, and he was told to abhi tak zinda hai, and that's when he gave up. So these kind of SOS calls went to the CMO. I later had the occasion to interact at length many years later, almost 10 years later, with Sanjeev Bhatt. And Sanjeev Bhatt at that point was number 2 in intelligence. I'd also interacted with Sri Kumar, who was head of intelligence for the state at that point. But Sanjeev was the operational head. So Sanjeev actually gave me far greater details of what had happened during that period. And I know that the CMO was constantly aware of exactly the nature and scale of the violence that was happening. But I didn't want to, in the film, get into that too much, because to me the film wasn't about, building a legal case against Modi. I knew that others were doing that, and they have done very serious work with that. It's just another matter that the judiciary failed us. First the Gujarat High Court and the Supreme Court failed us. and actually gave a clean chit of sorts, or refused to prosecute. But uh, you know, so to come back, when I went in March of 2002, I was horrified, and I actually shut down as an individual, as a person, because when you start hearing story after story, 10 stories, 20 stories from women who were saying how they were sexually molested, how they were raped, how Hindu women actually stripped them, handed them to men. You get horrified, and my brain shut down, my mind stopped working, because the scale of the tragedy. You're looking at children. I deliberately decided not to show too much blood and gore in the film, but I saw it firsthand. So I actually returned within a couple of days, and I said I can't make this film. And then it took me the better part of 6 months to decide what to do. And when I was saying that your students would find this useful, whenever you are going to make a film, there are some very basic and important questions you need to ask yourself, which is exactly what I did when I decided to do Final Solution. What is it that I am making the film about? Who is it for? What do I want to say? Okay. Now, I was very clear after a while. It took, after many months of confusion, I got clarity, and I resumed filming only on the 2nd of October, in fact, in 2002, on Mahatma Gandhi's birth anniversary, because it seemed a fitting date to go there. But it took me nearly 6 months to get that clarity. And the clarity was that I'm not making the film for the already converted. I do not want to preach to the choir. So the film is not meant for people who are already secular. It can't be for them. There is no point. The second aspect of clarity that I got was I cannot appeal to the fundamentalists. So the film cannot reach out to the fundamentalists, because the extremist is, the Hindutva extremist is operating at the level of faith. And you can't reason with faith, blind faith at that, and hatred at that. But it was my hope and hypothesis that maybe there are only 10-15% committed extremists filled with poison and hate. Maybe there are only 10% committed secularists. But the vast majority of Indians, the 70, 75, 80%, the in-between, the undecideds, the people who are either ignorant or apathetic, or just too busy with their own life, trying to somehow make a living, trying to somehow take care of their families. That's a vast majority of Indians. That's about 80%. So I decided that this film was for them, and that what the film would be is a mirror. That I wanted to hold the film as a mirror and ask them, is this what you want to support? Is this what you want your children to inherit? Is this what you want India to be? And my hope and hypothesis was that people would shrink back in horror and say no. Okay. Now, having got this basic clarity, then this in turn dictated the tone, tenor, style, nature of shooting. So, simple things I would point out, which will seem obvious to you now, but you would notice that there is not a single voiceover in the film. I decided not to narrate the film. My previous film, Aftershocks, was in fact the other extreme. It's a first-person narrative. But in this, I decided not to have a voiceover of any kind, either mine or a neutral voiceover. I decided that I will not show any blood and gore, because I felt that maybe my audience will react in the same way that I did. My brain shut down after looking at 1 hour of that scale of horror and atrocity, injured people and children, and photographs of burnt bodies and so on and so forth. So I decided that I will not show any of that. I also decided that I will act on location as my audience's eyes and ears. So that should be my style. So when my audience is actually sitting and watching it, it is as if they are there in the field and I'm asking simple questions on their behalf. And if you notice, my questions are also very, very simple. क्या हुआ, उसके बाद, कैसे, किसने किया, you know, there's not a single long question in the film. I, in any case, dislike that tendency, you know, many filmmakers fall in love with their own voice and keep speaking long, for long periods, asking long questions, and then you get very short answers. So it has to be the reverse. People have to be able to speak in their own voices. So that got very clear. Now, so, you know, since that clarity came, that dictated the technical style of shooting. And again, this is something that you know, the students here, the future filmmakers, should think this through. You know, my accent was on the fact that people should speak freely, and this is something that audiences worldwide have remarked, you know, over the last 20 years, wherever I've shown the film, that people open up to you, people share things with you, people are speaking of their most intensely personal experiences and feelings and fears. And how does that happen? And that was a very well thought out process. And as I said, you know, technically it was very well worked out. So just to give you small examples, I did not use a single tripod during the film, except when I was shooting the right wing, you know. Everything is handheld. The main camera I was doing, which was a palmcorder, a tourist palmcorder, you know, those who are technically minded, Sony TRV 100 at that point, which I would hold in one palm. And there was a second camera, which is slightly bigger, called PD 150 at that point, but there were just these two cameras. I did not use a single light. I did not use a microphone, because you know, push a microphone and you move it around and all that, you make people conscious. So and there was utter clarity within my team that nobody will say things like roll sound, roll camera, cut, and all of that. All these are nonsensical code words for us filmmakers. But the moment you sit in somebody's house and you're doing all this, you know, I mean, for want of a better word, I'll call it doing all this nautanki, saying, can you move? I need the light from this window. My cameraman had firm instructions that we will not ask anybody to move. I would just tell people, you sit wherever you're comfortable. आप जहाँ बैठते हैं रोज वहाँ बैठिए. It is my job to get the best frame possible, and I didn't care if I was not getting a good frame, because frames are not important. People are, emotions are, stories are. You know, at the end of the day, we have to have clarity that we are not documentary filmmakers, we are not short filmmakers, we are not feature filmmakers, we are storytellers. Our main job, our main focus is telling stories, communicating stories, making sure that stories that are being narrated on camera are touching the hearts and minds of people who are seeing it eventually on screen. So we are storytellers. Now I decided to tell my story through the documentary form, through cinema verite material. I was always listening very carefully and responding, reacting as a human being, not as a filmmaker, okay? And that is what most people responded to very directly. Because whether in the aftermath of a tragedy or even otherwise, when people actually decide to share their life or their personal story with you, what they see is whether you are, how interested you are. If you're distracted, if you're looking at your sound recordist, if you're looking at your frame, if you're checking your phone for questions and all of that, they also see that. They see your disinterest or lack of full engagement, and they also start responding accordingly. So I always maintained eye contact while shooting. And this is something that, you know, it was my hypothesis, it was my style of working, but with most people that I have filmed with, for this film, for Final Solution, I've had a relationship over the next 10, 15 years. I've constantly gone back. I went back for filming for the next 10, 12 years for follow-ups, which we'll talk about later. So, many of them have become friends, and I'm virtually a family member to them. So I've asked people about this, and why did you talk to me in the way that you talk to me? Because 20 people have come to you. I know 10 filmmakers came. I know 15, 20 media cameras came to you, but you never spoke like this. And this was their response to me, that we saw it in your eyes and we heard it in your voice, that you actually were interested in us and what we had to say. And that's why we kept opening up more and more to you. I will actually at this point digress a bit and speak about one clear example of this. I don't know those who saw the film yesterday or remember the film now. There's Sultana who's speaking to me on the terrace. She and I are speaking. She's sitting on a charpai, a cot, and she's speaking to me. Now, before meeting Sultana, before deciding to shoot that, I decided that I need to bring out these stories. But my biggest anxiety and my biggest worry was, how do I go and speak to women who have suffered the most horrific sexual violence? That too, by Hindu men. I was a male, a Hindu, and somebody they might not be comfortable with. So this was my biggest anxiety, my biggest fear. So I decided to seek help from my feminist friends, and through the network I identified a trauma counselor who'd worked with the survivors of sexual violence, and I requested her, and she was she saw my point, and she was also very keen on the fact that these stories should be brought out in a sensitive manner. So I sent her 10 days in advance to Sultana's village and to another village close by, which is where I shot with Madina, the other woman. So, when I landed up in the area after shooting in Ahmedabad and other parts of the state, I met this counselor activist who said to me that I don't think you should shoot with Sultana. She's too traumatized. She cannot speak. And I think it would be wrong to shoot with her. So I said, okay, fair enough, I will not shoot. But Mukhtar, who's part of the same story in Sultana, he's the one who's driving me around. So Mukhtar was my friend, contact. He was fighting for justice for all those people. He was, organizing all the evidence for CBI and others for the Supreme Court committee and so on. So Mukhtar said to me, Begum has cooked biryani for you, so of course you can't go. And after biryani, you have to spend time with my children because they've been hearing about you for months. So I said, okay, I'm not shooting. And I, in fact, had a nap in his house after lunch because the biryani was very good. But while leaving, he said to me, I said, before sunset, I want to reach Baroda. So before leaving, he said, तुम यहाँ तक आए हो तो सुल्ताना से मिल लो एक बार. So I said, हाँ ठीक है. And he said, तो एक काम करते हैं, we won't have tea at home. We will have tea with Sultana. Sultana was in hiding because she was under threat, and Mukhtar was the person who had kept her in hiding. So she was just a few homes away, 4 or 5 homes away. So we went over, and I sat down with Sultana, and we had tea. And at the, I'd barely finished my tea, and he said कि ये shooting क्या करनी है? तो I said कि कुछ नहीं, तुमने और मैंने बात करनी है खाली. So she said आप ही बात करेंगे, वो lady तो नहीं रहेंगी. So I said no, that lady won't be there. I'll talk to you if you want to talk to just me. So she said yeah, I want to talk to you. And I said okay, tell me when do I come back? So she said no, can't we talk now? So I said yeah. And I said, where do you want to talk? So she said, घर में बच्चा है, तो and an old lady. So I don't want to talk here. Can we go to the terrace and talk? So I said, okay, we'll go to the terrace and talk. And we went up. We climbed up. I sat down. I rolled my camera, and the rest you saw. all of it. Okay, uh, and it's the most powerful, moving, uh, you know, moment in the film for me. Sultana speaking the way she's speaking. So years later, 5 years later, in fact, I was visiting Sultana again, and Sultana had organized some food for me. That Rakesh bhai, you have to come and eat. आप मुख्तार के यहाँ खाना खाते हैं, मेरे यहाँ क्यों नहीं खाते? So ऐसे तुम शिकायत कर रही हो तो मैं आ रहा हूँ. So after lunch, I started talking to her and I said, Sultana, I want to understand what happened. तुमने मुझसे बात क्यों की? And why did you say that I don't want to talk with that lady? So she said to me a very simple thing that राकेश भाई, आप जब मुझसे बात कर रहे थे ना, आप इंसान की तरह बात कर रहे थे. वो जो है मुझसे ऐसे बात कर रही थी कि ये औरत है जिसका रेप हुआ है. So I mean, to translate, you were talking to me like a human being, while she was talking to me as if I was a rape victim who needed to be cotton wooled and spoken in a certain way and all of that. So, and I said, she said to me that I especially liked the fact that you joked with me. I mean, there was her kid was doing some silly things, so I was also cracking some harmless jokes. And she said, do you know something, that I laughed for the first time after months with you. And it was then that I decided that I want to speak to you, because you treated me like an insan. So, it is extremely important when you are in a situation like this, with any survivor, male, child, I'll also talk about Ijaz to you, the child who I begin the film with and end the film with. And again, the same thing will come across, that you don't look for material, you don't look for stories, you don't even look for footage. If necessary, don't even roll your camera. And there were many such moments when I didn't roll my camera and just heard people. And later, if they decided to speak to me, we spoke. If they didn't speak to me, that was fine. In such a context, you have to respond first as a human being, and only then as a filmmaker. If you begin to situate yourself as a filmmaker, if that is your only vantage point and that's your only gaze, then that's wrong, and that it will always reflect in your material. It will, that alienation, that distance, that lack of empathy, understanding, everything will reflect in your material itself. So to come back to Ijaz, the child I begin the film with and end the film with. This is what happens when you only sort of keep responding without having a set agenda in your mind of what you're shooting and how you're shooting, or with the, who you're shooting with, and so on. I was actually shooting this other sequence you saw in the film with the children in the classroom. Who were saying that I was studying in that school and I was thrown out of that school and I have to now study in this school. So I shot in both the schools. So in this Muslim school, the national school, I was shooting with these older children. So this young boy walked in and he started pulling my kurta. So I got irritated because, he was basically making my camera shake. It was in my hand and he was just tugging at my kurta. So I said to him, "Kya chahiye tujhe?" So he said, "Mera photo lena hai." So then I stopped for a minute. I said, "मैं photo ये काम खत्म करने के बाद लूँगा. तुम एक काम करो, तुम यहाँ बैठ जाओ." And I put him on the table. और जो मैं कर रहा हूँ वो देखो, चुपचाप आवाज़ नहीं निकालना. So he sat there quietly, and I shot with all the kids, and I was walking around and all that. And I'd finished shooting, and I had shut my camera, and the other camera had gone. And Reshma, who was their teacher, I said, I'm leaving, and thank you so much, and all that. And I had come out of the room, and he came running and started tugging my kurta again. And he said, "तुमने बोला था photo लेगे." So I said, yeah, of course I promised you. तो तुम बताओ कहाँ पे photo लेना है? So he said, "Not in this classroom. This is their classroom. You have to come to my classroom." So I said, "Okay, we'll go to your classroom." And I said, "Okay, what photo do you want?" So he said, "I want to be sitting on this stool with the blackboard at the back, because I like this blackboard very much." So I picked him up, put him on the stool, and the blackboard background. And as I started rolling the camera, that's the conversation you hear, without any editing. That is exactly the way it unfolded, our interaction.
I hadn't thought that I will find a child, I will look for a child, and I will get these moments, and this moment will be the beginning of my film and the end of. I hadn't thought of any of this. This is just something that just spontaneously happened, you know. Ijaz, of course, has been very close to me for years now, and now he's a young man of in his 20s, and he's become a real estate agent, and he's very happy, and so on and so forth. But even Ijaz spoke to me about it. He said to me that after you had left, I went back and talked to teacher Reshma, and then I told my parents also that I met a Hindu who was nice. He was unable to believe on camera that I was a Hindu, because anybody who did not abuse and did not get violent could not be a Hindu. And he was convinced that I was a Muslim. And his teachers had to actually explain to him that no, he is a Hindu. And when I'd made the film and I'd actually gone to their home to give them a copy of the film, and we saw it together, that sequence, Ijaz and I. At that point, he said to me, "Abhi mujhe pata hai tum Hindu ho." So what I'm trying to say is that as filmmakers, do not, have a vision about why you're doing things, and the way you want to do things, the tone, nature, style of filmmaking and all that I've shared with you. But don't have a set agenda on the day that you're shooting with people, that you want to speak in a certain manner with them, or you're looking for certain kinds of material, because that itself then begins to take you away from the truth of their stories. One sort of additional connected point I want to make is, in India we have this great tradition of hospitality. Mehman ghar pe aaya hai, guest has come home, so we should be hospitable. So in Gujarat, this hospitality had taken another shape and form, which is people would say, please have some water, have some chai, do you want biscuit or do you want namkeen? And tell me what is the soundbite you want. Okay? So offering a soundbite had become a part of hospitality. And I was in fact being taken by somebody once who said to me, I want you to speak to this particular woman who has given 82 interviews. And I said, this is a woman I do not wish to speak to. I do not, and I took pains to explain to everybody that I do not want a soundbite, that I am not a TV channel or a crew who's looking for nice statements, good statements that are good for camera. People have become savvy as well. So they judge you, they understand who you are, they situate you, and they give you the material that they think you want. So it's your challenge to actually junk and discard that, to have a dialogue and say, no, I'm not interested in any of that, I'm interested in you and your story and the reality.
What was particularly interesting was that you actually robbed my question. I wanted to ask you about whether it was a deliberate choice on your part to employ that gentle nudging, and despite the cacophony of the colors and the terrible rabble-rousing and the general din of the Jubilean uproar and all that, and also when Sultana speaks, what do you call, the absolute indifference that comes from the terror that you must have experienced. And in when you said
that itself was so chilling.
Yeah, that was so chilling to watch. And when you said that you decided not to show the blood and the gore, you don't necessarily have to do that. The soundscape actually speaks. And the soundscape in contrast with your voice which is the sanest voice, so gentle, so the minimal intervention, you're nudging people to speak. And that actually speaks about the gap. I'm not a film studies person at all. I'm looking at it as a storyteller. So it actually speaks about the things that you cannot speak in the documentary, the things which have to be left unsaid and for the audience to understand. And it was a wonderful experience in that sense. And I wanted to ask you whether, because I'm not a film person, I wanted to ask you whether it was a strategy, and then you really explained that it was a strategy. that contrast was actually astounding. Thank you.
Thank you for your observation and your appreciation. Just a minor correction, it wasn't a strategy, so to say. That's the way I am in life. So, and that reflects on camera, whether I was shooting in Gujarat or later when I was shooting in other spaces, in my later work as well. That's the way I am in my life. So, that persona also comes across on camera. But two very small and quick points I want to make to you. And again, this for the students, this is something to ponder about. As important, if not more important than asking questions and responding, reacting, is the art silences. You need to learn to be silent during conversations on camera. Since you were speaking about Sultana, there were many moments when Sultana expected me to speak and ask something. And I was just silent and I was just looking into her eyes, holding her gaze. And after a silence, she would start speaking again. So the sheer absence of any question actually made it much more powerful, And in my case, when I was speaking to Sultana, I didn't really want to ask too much, because I wanted her to say what she wanted to say and what she was comfortable with. As I said, at the back of my head, I had those fears about being a Hindu and a male and, practically from the same type of people who had actually carried out the worst atrocity on her. That anxiety was still there at the back of my head somewhere, even though I was reacting to her. And so the silences actually become more potent and powerful than even the most powerful questions. And the third thing that I want to respond to, blood and gore. The only time, it's a relentless film. It's a horrendous watch and a hard watch because I deliberately decided to make it a very relentless film. You don't get breathing spaces in the film. You don't get any escape routes anywhere. I give you little, moments where you can let go and breathe, and then I bring back something and sock you in the gut and agitate your brain again by saying this is exactly what had happened. This is a tussle I had with my great friend Anand Patwardhan. He and I have known each other since the late 1980s. And when he saw the cut, he'd been dying to see the film in the making, but I said I refused to show it. And only when I'd finished it, he saw the film. And he said, why have you made it like this? He said it's extremely powerful, but there's no note of hope at the end. And I argued, and I said, I refuse to inject a note of hope because this is how I felt. This is the truth of my 2 years in Gujarat at that point. I saw no hope. I only felt despair and despondency. And this is exactly what I want my audiences to feel. So the decision actually was very deliberate to show only 3 or 4 visuals of blood and gore at the end in that song that I end with, After the Child. And on that song, I put close-ups of everybody you saw in the film, as if reinforcing and reminding you what you have seen, so that when you left the hall, after the screening, you went home disturbed, so that it agitated your brain and really shocked you even days later, because that got reinforced at the end. I refuse to put, the classic sort of moment that us documentary filmmakers actually want to put in these kind of situations, which is a set of people doing a candlelight vigil going around, marching, singing, we shall overcome, hum honge kamyab. And then the audience thinks that somebody is doing something about it and they will become kamyab, so we don't need to do anything about it. I wanted to do the reverse. I wanted to sock you in the gut, agitate your mind so much that it disturbed you for not just that day, but for weeks and months if possible.
My name is Melvia, research scholar, Malayalam University. I'm from creative writing, not from film studies. It's my first experience in a film festival, and after watching the film, I really wondered you are still here. And what I'm about to ask, I know it has been asked by many people all over the world, but out of my curiosity, can you recollect one or two strange responses that you got from your family or friends or relatives after the very first screening of the film?
Luckily, my friends and family, it's a very small sort of circle. Luckily, all of them are progressive minded, so I didn't have any strange reactions from them. But I'm trying to read between the lines of the creative writer in you. There were a variety of responses that I got from people, and some of them were indeed extreme threats of various kinds as well. People who were extremely upset with the kind of film I'd made and the fact that it had circulated so much, and with the fact that there was a media buzz and people were talking about it, and political groups were using the film and so on and so forth. So, maybe, okay, I mean, I was trying to self-censor myself, but I'll share it anyway. So what used to happen at some point is there's a group of right-wingers who decided to give me death threats, okay? So they used to call me on my landline, making sure that I understood that they have my home address and my home phone number. Usually about 1 o'clock at night or maybe at 2. And those days I was a night bird, so I used to be awake at that point. They would think that they were disturbing me in my sleep. And they would start talking to me about graphic ways in which they would do things to me and my family. And I would just laugh, okay? So at some point, one day they called, and I think I was in a very strange mood. So when they started talking to me about the sexual horrors they would commit on my wife, and the way they would lynch my children and kill them and chop them in various parts and all that, I actually lost it and I started laughing hysterically. And he abused me and said, "Why the hell are you laughing?" And I said, all this is a great plan, and I love your plan. There's only one problem. I'm not married, and I don't have children. So I said to him, do me a favor, why don't you get me married off to somebody from Durga Vahini, some right-wing activist, and then you kill her the next day. I don't have a problem. So he also started laughing, and he said to me, it's impossible to deal with a character like you, and they stopped calling me. I didn't want to share this, but since you asked. But the larger point here is intimidation works only if you choose to get intimidated. If you are not getting intimidated, what the hell can they do,
ഫൈനൽ സൊല്യൂഷൻ എന്ന് പറയുന്നത് ഈ സിനിമ കണ്ട് അത്രയും തവണ ഞാനൊരു 2-3 തവണ ഇത് കണ്ടിട്ടുണ്ട്. കംപ്ലീറ്റ് ചെയ്യാൻ പറ്റാത്ത ഭയങ്കര ഒരു വേദന ഇതിനകത്ത് ഉണ്ടായിട്ടുണ്ട്. അപ്പോൾ എനിക്ക് അറിയാനായിട്ട് താല്പര്യമുള്ളത് ഗുജറാത്തിൽ ഈ ഒരു സിനിമ ഡോക്യുമെൻ്ററി ഇക്കാലത്തും എന്താ പറയുക പ്രദർശിപ്പിക്കാനായിട്ട് സാധിക്കുന്നുണ്ടോ, അല്ലെങ്കിൽ അന്ന് അവിടെ ഗുജറാത്തിൽ ഇത് പ്രദർശിപ്പിച്ച സമയത്ത് അതിൻ്റെ ഒരു റെസ്പോൺസ് എങ്ങനെയായിരുന്നു? പ്രത്യേകിച്ചും നമ്മളുടെ അനന്ത് പട്വർദ്ധൻ്റെ മറ്റേ ഡോക്യുമെൻ്ററി പ്രദർശനം, അതെ, ലോസ്റ്റ് ആയി പോകുന്നു, ഭയങ്കര നെർവസ് ആവുന്നു. ഇത്ര അറിഞ്ഞാൽ മതി.
you asked about screening in Gujarat and how is the reaction, and is it possible to screen now in Gujarat? Okay. So I talked about the censor troubles. The first version of the film was nearly 4 hours long. So my censor battle, I got a censor certificate for that. Then I made a 2.5 hour version, and to make sure that BJP anywhere in the country couldn't object that the version that got censor certificate was 4 hours and there's a new cut. I got a second censor certificate for the version that you saw, 2.5 hour version. And then a year later, when I had earned enough money, I decided to make a Gujarati version of the film for circulation only in Gujarat. So I made a Gujarati version, and I got a third censor certificate for the Gujarati version alone. And I actually went into Gujarat, and this was, I think, either end of 2005 or early 2006. And in my first round, I held 20 public screenings. This was when Mr. Amit Shah was the Home Minister and Mr. Modi was the Chief Minister. And not a single screening of mine was disrupted, disturbed by VHP or Bajrang Dal, because I heard later, I'd known that, I'd expected this, but I heard a confirmation later that there were strict orders given to the cadres not to disturb any film screening. Because by that time I had ensured that not just Indian press, but the international press had spoken extensively. And 2006 is also when, as an aside, and we can talk about that, people who are interested, we can talk outside about it. But what had happened was I was filming in New York for a film that I wanted to do in multiple cities. And I was arrested by NYPD as a suspected terrorist. And then I sued NYPD, and I sued New York City, the mayor. And that was an ongoing court case at that point. So Sanjeev, in fact, told me about it, saying, that was the best thing you could have done, because all these people got scared that if he is doing this kind of thing in New York, imagine if something happens here, what will he do? And this will result in bad press for us. So purely because of that, I was able to get away by screening as much as I could. I, in fact, pushed my luck, and BJP controlled Nehru Yuvak Kendra network. I actually forced them to screen my film. So I screened my film through 6 Nehru Yuvak Kendras in 6 districts, where the entire board was BJP. But they couldn't say no to me, because I would say that aap boliye na, and I will go to the press about it. So again, the larger point is you have to push your luck. When you think you can get away with it, just push the envelope as much as you can.
ആദ്യമായിട്ടാണ് ആ ഫിലിം കാണുന്നത്. പക്ഷെ അത് കണ്ടപ്പോൾ അറിഞ്ഞതിലും ഏറെ, അതായത് വായിച്ചതിലും അറിഞ്ഞതിലും ഏറെ വളരെ ഡിസ്റ്റർബ്ഡ് ആയിരുന്നു അത് ഫിലിം എന്നുള്ളതാണ്. അതിൽ ആ ഫിലിമിൻ്റെ അവസാനം ആ കുട്ടി ഇജാസ് പറയുന്നത്, സാർ അതിൽ ചോദിക്കുന്നുണ്ട്, ഞാനൊരു ഹിന്ദുവാണ് എങ്കിലും ഇത്ര നല്ലതാണ് ഈ ഫിലിമൊക്കെ എടുക്കുന്നെങ്കിൽ കൊല്ലുവാൻ തന്നെയാണോ ചോദിക്കുന്നതെന്ന് ചോദിക്കുമ്പോൾ അവൻ അങ്ങനെ തന്നെയാണ് ആഗ്രഹിക്കുന്നത്. പക്ഷേ ഇന്നലെ ഞങ്ങൾ അതിനെക്കുറിച്ച് ഇങ്ങനെ വല്ലാതെ ഡിസ്റ്റർബ്ഡായിട്ട് നമ്മൾ ചർച്ച ചെയ്തപ്പോൾ ഞങ്ങൾ ഓർത്ത് ഓരോ പൂമുട്ടിലും അറിഞ്ഞുകൊണ്ട് തന്നെ നമ്മളിങ്ങനെ വെറുപ്പിൻ്റെ ഒരു പുഴുക്കുത്താക്കുകയാണല്ലോ. പക്ഷേ ഇന്നിപ്പോൾ സാർ പറഞ്ഞു അവനെ അതിന് ശേഷം കണ്ടെന്നും നല്ല ഹിന്ദുക്കളെ അവൻ കണ്ടുമുട്ടി. അപ്പോൾ എല്ലാവരും അങ്ങനെയല്ല, അങ്ങനെയുള്ള ഒരു മനസ്സിൻ്റെ ഒരു മാറ്റം. അപ്പോൾ എനിക്ക് തോന്നുന്നു ഈ ഫിലിം നമ്മൾ ഗുജറാത്തിലല്ല, കേരളത്തിൽ തന്നെ എല്ലായിടത്തും ഇപ്പോൾ കാണിക്കേണ്ട ഒരു സമയമാണ്. അപ്പോൾ ശരിക്കും അത്തരം ഒരു ഇജാസിന് ആ കുഞ്ഞിന് അങ്ങനെ ഒരു മാറ്റം ഉണ്ടായെങ്കിൽ തീർച്ചയായിട്ടും നമ്മളത് ഈ കോർണർ നമ്മളത് കാണിക്കണം. അപ്പം അത് മാറ്റങ്ങൾ ഉണ്ടാക്കും എന്നുള്ളൊരു പ്രതീക്ഷ തരുന്നുണ്ട്.
I completely agree with you. In fact, I spoke twice about it yesterday. The fact that I am, as a political observer, I was extremely worried after looking at election data from Kerala after the Lok Sabha results. And it was not just the Thrissur seat or the close contest in Trivandrum, I looked at assembly segment data, and in over a couple of dozen assembly segments, BJP is actually very strong, and in the next assembly elections, it could be it can happen that BJP wins 20 seats and is number 2 in 20 other seats, and that would be the most dangerous thing to happen, because this is how they began in Gujarat in the 1980s and the early 90s, and then they got a stranglehold over power. This is how they began in Madhya Pradesh, and this is how in 1991 they got their first victory in UP. So I just hope that this never happens in Kerala, and if films like mine or Anand Patwardhan's or other filmmakers can make a difference, they should be used. And as I said yesterday in my inaugural address, that it is not, it should not be seen as a fight in the political arena alone. It is a fight for the hearts and minds of the people, and their art, cinema, songs, theatre, various kinds of art, they can make the most, the deepest impact. So, I think political parties have to look at all cultural tools available to them to fight this monster. I did not answer the second part of your question. No, her question. Is it possible to show the film in Gujarat now? I haven't tried, and I mean, frankly, it's not relevant to show this film in Gujarat. But I want to share this other aspect of it, which is I kept filming in Gujarat for the next 10 or 12 years. And this was at a time when many filmmaker friends would ask me, is it safe to go and shoot in Gujarat? And I would say that if somebody like I can go and shoot, and I was being, anytime I went, there was 4 or 5 sets of people who were following me. The right-wing cadre themselves, special branch, somebody else, local police station. So, I've learned how to dodge and how to still get my own material and all of that. So I would say that if I can go personally and shoot still, it is possible to, for anybody to shoot. It sort of circles back to the point that I made to you earlier, that intimidation happens only when you choose to get intimidated. If you do not get intimidated and you keep working, fine, they might arrest me, they might keep me in lockup for a day or a week. I refuse to get intimidated by that. I did get arrested within the first week of shooting Final Solution, and I dealt with it at that point. That's a separate story. So I kept filming, and for the follow-up film, which I was calling Final Solution Revisited, which got delayed because of health issues that I had for long years, but I have literally filmed about 400 hours of material, and that material is getting edited into a series of films. In it, I not just went back to the people I filmed with, so a classic revisit of the story 5 years later or 10 years later. So you will see what happened to Ijaz 10 years later. How does he think and how does he feel now? Not just that, there were many dimensions that I could not probe in the immediate aftermath of the violence. The ambiguities and the ambivalences, the grey areas that I could not probe. And to give you an example of what I mean by the grey area is I focused a lot in my follow-up filming 5 years later and 10 years later on the Hindutva foot soldier. People who were arrested on rioting and arson charges, not people who killed and raped and did the more horrible crimes, but foot soldiers. The actual sort of people who spent time in Sabarmati jail. And I will actually share one piece of statistics with you, which is what motivated me to actually start probing this in great detail. For 5 years I actually followed this between 2007 and 2012. The Jati Nirmulan Samiti of Gujarat, the anti-caste coalition of Gujarat, had published a report in Gujarati that a pamphlet literally, which talked about the caste composition of prisoners of the 2002 riot cases inside Sabarmati jail. And that was, and I quote from memory, so I could be mistaken here and there a little bit, 2 Brahmins, 4 Patels, 17 other upper castes, 746 OBCs, 747 Dalits. And last 2 figures I'm absolutely sure about, 746 and 797. In other words, over 95% of people who were rotting in Sabarmati jail after 2002, on charges of 2002 rioting, were OBC and Dalit. These are, foot soldiers who were used, exploited, cynically discarded, left to rot in jail. So I went back, I went to a number of them across Ahmedabad and across Panchmahals, which, where Bilqis, Sultana and all those people were situated. And it was the same story there, except that instead of OBCs, there were greater number of tribals and Dalits. So I have actually, I began to look at even those foot soldiers as victims of sorts. And this is something that a lot of secular activist friends of mine are, not happy with me about or disagree with me about. But I have my reasons why I look at it. I say that it is politically incorrect, even strategically incorrect, to just dismiss a large population as monsters. You need to understand what happened, why they were pulled in, how they were pulled in, and you need to actually work on those objective conditions at the ground level. So I've not just looked at the foot soldiers and their personal stories and what happened, but I've also looked at why they first got attracted to the BJP or the right-wing ideology, right from closure of mills in Ahmedabad city to the great unemployment that happened, to other factors. But there's also, apart from understanding it in the historic context, and apart from sharing that understanding with my audiences, the other aspect of this was even more direct and obvious to me, that if and when I screen that film to Dalit youths and OBC youths who look at 10 stories, 15 stories, 20 stories of people from the previous generation, youths like them, who were used and discarded, they should get the feeling, man, we shouldn't get involved in this. Because what is going to happen is all these upper castes are going to get away and we are going to get screwed. Sorry for that unparliamentary word. But they should get that feeling. And to me, that would be my greatest political intervention as a filmmaker. If I'm able to persuade a number of Dalit and OBC youth not to get attracted to this, that will be very important. So yes, it is very alarming that the right wing, especially the RSS, is making sure that changes are being carried out at various levels in the education sector, in the curriculum, in the textbooks themselves. I know, with the NCERT, Suhas Palshikar and Yogendra Yadav, who's a great friend of mine, had headed a committee many years ago, this is under the UPA government, where they had introduced various kinds of changes in NCERT textbooks, including references to contemporary political events, including providing links to films or mentions of books and novels and stories that people could read, if they were reading about political science or civics. In that, for a wider perspective, they could go refer to other material. And all those changes have, all those progressive changes have been taken out by the right wing. And they've dropped all kinds of chapters on all kinds of things. So yes, that's happening as a concerted design. they don't want people to know certain kinds of truths. Starting with the fact that Savarkar wrote 6 apology letters. He was certainly no Veer, and if he was Veer, then hundreds of people who were in the same Port Blair Andaman's jail, who were hanged or served life sentences, they are Mahaveers and Paramveers, in that sense. But this whitewashing of history, this whitewashing of contemporary politics, is a strategy by right wing, not just in India but worldwide. And it needs to be countered. So you're very right about that. And can't be countered just by films or filmmakers. It needs to be countered by everybody. It needs to be countered by parents in their homes. It needs to be countered by teachers in their classrooms. It needs to be countered by writers, writing non-fiction and fiction. It needs to happen right across. So yes, it is a danger. It is a clear and present danger, but it needs to be combated. As far as the films are concerned, there is a suggestion that I wanted to make personally to Minister Comrade Bindu, who was there yesterday for the inauguration ceremony. And I do hope, I made the suggestion in my speech, and I do hope it gets communicated to her directly. What I said was that it would be a great start if all educational institutions started buying digital copies of films from filmmakers. Because us independent filmmakers, and the younger ones especially, always struggle for resources and funding. So I said, even if you are looking at panchayats that can have screenings on their computers in the panchayat office, or you have educational institutions, schools and colleges. So if 1,000 digital copies or 2,000 digital copies are acquired by the government, for a certain film, even at a nominal price of 500 rupees per copy, that's only, for 2,000 copies, it's only 10 lakhs. If you start creating a bank of even 20 such films or 50 such films, that's 2 crores or 5 crores, which is nothing for a government. But it's a substantial resource for use available in the educational institutional network, which the government does, can sort of intervene in and ensure that these kind of resources are available in these institutions. So I do hope that the minister takes it up and this happens.
Sir, it's just a curiosity question in extension to her first question. Sir, do you believe or think that your name itself provides you a certain level of safety? I hope you understood your question.
No, of course. It's a very good question, and yes, I'm extremely aware of the caste privilege my name provides me, and I'm also extremely aware of the fact that it completely opened up access within the right wing to me. Many people are very shocked and surprised about the kind of access I was able to manage for myself with the VHP and with the RSS Pracharaks and all of that. But this is where, to quote Rohit Vemula, the accident of my birth comes as an advantage for me, and I fully use it. Just to give you an example, Prahlad Shastri, this hardcore preacher that you saw in the film, his public meeting got disrupted by a cow, and then he started speaking again. So I had to meet Prahlad Shastri the day before to say that I want to shoot one of your public meetings and then maybe also shoot an interview with you. So Prahlad Shastri and 2 other people from local VHP and one RSS senior person sat. They wanted to check who I am. So they started talking to me, and the senior RSS person quoted a shloka in Sanskrit, and I corrected him. Then Prahlad Shastri quoted another shloka in Sanskrit from the Gita, from the Bhagavad Gita, and I corrected him. So in their eyes, I became a bigger Brahmin than them. And they said to me, Rakesh Bhai, you are most welcome. And, to actually elaborate even further, so I went with Prahlad Shastri for his meeting, but his convoy was at very high speed, 120 kilometers, and our driver was driving very safely. So we got left behind. So by the time I arrived at the location, he had already started his public speech and all that. And you saw how jam-packed it was, you know. So I was at the other end of the Chauraha, in the market, literally half a kilometer, at the back of the crowd. So he saw my camera because I was holding the camera like this, waving to him. He stopped his speech. He said, "Clear a path for my friend Rakesh ji." So the path was cleared for me and everybody. I climbed on stage and I'm shooting like that right next to him. And yes, it wouldn't have been possible without the kind of surname I happen to have, and without the accident of my birth, and a greater accident that the shlokas they quoted were from the bank of 20 shlokas that I remember. If they quoted something else, I would be clueless. So there were two questions asked for those people who couldn't hear it at the back. The second question, the shorter one was Godhra itself a Hindutva conspiracy? Did they do it themselves and start blaming others? And the first part of what she said was that yes, there's a need to screen this film and similar work all across Kerala now, given the current context. But today's youth and people have smaller, shorter attention spans. So can we keep that in mind and maybe have a shorter version? And can we also have a version with Malayalam subtitles? So I'm very happy to announce here that just before I walked in here, the Malayalam subtitles are going to happen. Please get up, and he and his team are doing the Malayalam subtitles. So I just committed to him that I'm sending him the master copy of the film and the English subtitles so he can translate. Now to come back to the shorter attention spans, yes, I'm extremely aware of it. In fact, I would disagree with you and say today's youth does not have a 1 hour attention span. It is shorts, reels, okay? So I anticipated this, and in fact, many friends of mine are aghast, filmmaker friends, that how can you butcher your own film like this? And I say, my idea is to reach audiences. So I have myself uploaded about 15-20 excerpts of the film, which are between 5 and 10 minutes of duration only. The idea is that maybe you'll watch 4 excerpts at some point, or maybe you get motivated to see the entire film after watching an excerpt. And I've made the film available for free online, forever for India. So anybody who is interested can just Google, see my film for free on YouTube, on my own Vimeo channel. On YouTube, at least 20-30 people have uploaded the film because I've always said, pirate my work and upload it as much as you want. So I have myself done shorts, and once the Malayalam subtitles come in, I will make sure that Malayalam shorts are also available.
Media
Godhra. Sorry, that is an important question. Except that it cannot be answered in a very short way. Because I have looked at the evidence in the Godhra case in great detail. And when I say evidence, I have actually looked at the evidence that was produced in court. I've looked at affidavits, I've looked at forensic reports, I've looked at police versions, I've looked at fire brigade timelines, I've looked at, as I said, all the court filings. I have, 20 sort of big folders, the dossiers that were filed in Supreme Court, and then with the Banerjee committee that was set up by the Railway Ministry to look into the fire in Godhra. So I will not get into great detail, though I can speak for hours about it, but I will just point 3 or 4 facts that don't stand up to any scrutiny of the, fact number one is that when the train stops eventually at Signal Phalia, which is where it stops, the signalman, who's in the cabin at a height, he looks at the train and his testimony, first to his report to the railway headquarters, then to the police, and then his affidavit that was filed in court, is that when the train stopped, there was already a heavy plume of smoke, grey dark smoke, turning black, which was coming out from the center of the train. Okay. Now, assume Dunu Roy, the activist and scientist from Delhi, he did an analysis of the fact that the length of the train was about 1.5 kilometers. If you look at all the coaches in that particular Sabarmati Express. So the Signal Phalia signalman sees smoke rising around 3/4 kilometer away, which means there's a substantial volume of smoke there, which means that fire couldn't have been set at Signal Phalia, which is the prosecution case that Muslims from Signal Phalia came running and set fire. The TT of S6 who got on to the train from Ratlam station was never allowed to board the coach. So he was traveling in the guard's cabin, which is at the other end, behind the train, at the back of the train. Now the TT and the guard, their reports to Western Railway headquarters in Baroda and Bombay, and their testimonies to the police confirm and corroborate exactly this, that when the train stopped, they jumped off the guard's cabin at the back and they saw smoke rising from the center of the train. If you look at the fire, people have done analysis, scientists have done analysis of all the materials inside the coach, right from Rexine to coir to wood and all of that, and how much time will it take for them to catch fire, and the volume of smoke to first turn from white to grey to dark black, and then the volume of smoke to actually become visible at a distance. Okay, and their timeline seems to suggest that the fire couldn't have been set at Signal Phalia. It was probably set at Godhra platform. Okay, now let's now come back to what happened at Godhra platform itself. Now at Godhra platform, two incidents happened. As the train drew into Godhra, car sevaks who had been creating ruckus all throughout the route. At Ratlam station they'd beaten up vendors, at other stations that they'd beaten up tea sellers and food sellers. In a station called Rudoli in UP, they had actually stabbed somebody on this train itself, car sevaks traveling on this train. So when they pulled into Godhra, there was a tea vendor called Siddiq Bakar, and they took tea from him and refused to pay him. When he asked for money, they started tugging at his beard and started beating him. So, all these vendors, and this was early in the morning, this was happening. So, word went around to the nearest locality that Hindu VHP boys are beating our vendors, our Muslim vendors. So, some people came to defend him. But in the meanwhile, the other thing that happened was that there was a girl called Sophia Sheikh, a 16-year-old girl called Sophia Sheikh, who was waiting at the platform with her aunt and her mother. And some of the boys misbehaved with her, tried to pull her into the train, but she was able to extricate herself, and the family was able to run away and go and hide in the room next to the assistant station master's room. And they were safe. But by the time the people came to defend Siddiq Bakar, and the rumor that went around was our girl has been abducted and she's inside, because nobody could see her anywhere. So that's what they started. The skirmish was about the fact that the local Muslims felt that the 16-year-old Sophia Sheikh was actually being assaulted inside the train right at that moment, and their entire thing was, you give her back to us. So stone pelting started happening, These guys were pelting stones, and the car sevaks were picking up stones from the track, and they were throwing stones. And this is also something I've corroborated from the car sevaks who were traveling in the train itself. In fact, there was a very provocative conversation I had with one car sevak boy. And I said to him that you are such, brave warriors. Shame on you. How the hell could you allow 40 women and children to burn inside the coach? Why haven't I heard that 20 car sevak boys lost their life trying to rescue the women and children? Why is it that only they died? And they said to us that Rakesh bhai, the fire was extremely rapid and you don't know how it happened and what happened. And by the time we actually tried to alight into the coach from either of the doors, berths number 1 to 9 or 1 to 8 and 72 to 64, the corner berths, they were all in such heavy fire that we could only get a few people out. And because of the stone pelting at Godhra platform, what had happened was they put all the shutters of the windows down so that the glass shards didn't fly and injure anybody. So all the women and children had been made to climb the top berths to protect them from the stones and the fragments of glass that were flying around, so that they didn't get injured. So they could not get down from the top berths in time rapidly enough to try and run to the main door. They got trapped, and that's why they died there. So the prosecution case was that this mob that came from Signal Falia, the first set of Gujarat forensic lab reports that came, they debunked the theory that Gujarat government had till then advanced, that this fire was set through the doors. People climbed up on through the doors because there were no traces of hydrocarbons found there. And there were any number of car sevak testimonies that they had actually locked the doors facing Signal Falia and the other side. Okay, so when the doors were locked, how the hell could anybody get into the coach and set fire? So then and this was a Gujarat State Forensic Lab report. So this was not something they could accuse anybody about. This was their own lab. So then they now came up with a new theory, and on the basis of this theory, convictions have happened in the Supreme Court, that the crowd that came from Signal Falia brought with them 60-liter jerry cans, 2 jerry cans filled with petrol, and swords, and they cut open the canvas of the vestibule, climbed into the vestibule, the connecting passage between 2 coaches, and that's how they entered the train, because the fact was that the doors were locked. Now that's, to my mind, utter nonsense. Absolute nonsense, because there is not a single eyewitness that actually saw them doing this. There is no testimony. It's just a prosecution theory that has been accepted by partisan judiciary. Second, this covering, the canvas covering and, in the vestibule, in the passage, it's very tough. It's made to withstand train speeds of 120, 150 kilometers per hour. You try to slash it with a sword and it'll take you a full day and you would still not be able to cut upon a hole. So to say that they not only just slashed it, but parted it, and few men were able to get through it and pour petrol is nonsensical. And the third sort of fact that doesn't gel with me is I have personally, with my camera, walked from S5 to S6 and back. Okay. As you exit S6 and come into S5, there is actually no evidence of any fire. So if somebody got through the vestibule and poured liquid, liquid would splash, not just in one direction, and the fire would actually also spread into S5. But the bathroom plywood and the sunmica on top of the plywood of the S5 coach were barely dark because there was fire there in the other coach. So some amount of darkness happened, but nothing burned. And certainly the bathroom door is completely intact. And certainly the berths that follow Nothing happened there. Neither to the flooring, nor to the birds, nor to the window. And this is a walk I've done with my own camera, not just once, but 2-3 times, because I wanted to record this evidence, at Godhra station myself. So all these facts don't sit with the theory. I mean, that Muslims burned the train and Signal Falia mob burned the train and all of that. As to who did, I will not venture to speculate, but we can all imagine.
സാർ എൻ്റെ ക്വസ്റ്റ്യൻ എന്ന് പറഞ്ഞാൽ മീഡിയ കവറേജ് ഓഫ് കമ്മ്യൂണൽ വയലൻസ് ഇല്ലേ, ഇത് ഇത് സാറിൻ്റെ ഒരു ഫൈനൽ സൊല്യൂഷന് എടുക്കുമ്പോൾ റിയാലിറ്റി ആയിട്ട് കമ്പയർ ചെയ്യുമ്പോൾ സാറിന് തോന്നിയ കാര്യം എന്താണ്?
You must remember this was India 20 years ago. So media hadn't transformed to Godi media at that point. The laptop media that we have today. There were many independent voices. People were not so afraid. So, in fact, 2002 is practically the first televised riot of the country, where people actually saw things happening on their television screens. And not just people like Barkha or Rajdeep or the NDTV teams, but even teams from ZTV, Aaj Tak, they all reported quite fearlessly and quite objectively. So in that sense, there wasn't any conflict. The difference was that when TV reportage happens, it touches the surface, because they want to present facts as fast as possible and take images and put them on screen for that night. When I was making a film, that wasn't my objective, so I was able to probe things in greater detail and greater depth. So that was the only difference. No conflict.
Now, I have worked with you almost 15 years. Two things, like S5, S6, that tape I still remember. That is what we named S5, S6. Okay. But the relationship which you carry with the people. In Gujarat, I used to get beer. Okay, when I go to shoot. Okay.
Yeah, because
So,
they would organize things for Rakesh by his Malayali friend who likes beef kebabs.
Beef.
So anywhere we went, they would just organize it specially for him.
Yeah. So the question is that, you very sensitively, actually, when we look at, I still remember the early days of screening Final Solution, and I did the pirate and copy campaign, okay, across the country, and
Can I
just got back.
Can I just stop you for a second? I gave Deepu used to run pedestrian pictures in Bangalore, a screening collective, and I gave him my master tape, and I said, "You make a Kannada version." And I never talked to him. 5 years later, when we started working together in 2009, he was shooting for me, and he said to me, "You've never asked me this. All filmmakers ask me, but you've never asked me. Do you know how many copies I made?" And I said, "No." He said 7,000 copies in the first batch in Kannada. And I was very happy. Rated on that in great detail for half an hour.
Hi, yeah. Since Dibu is here, we would like to share you one experience when we tried to film his screening. I'm Gauri. We arranged a screening in Bangalore as a part of the film festival, and we went to Kavita Language to invite her for. Dibu may be remembering. At the moment we visited Kavita Language, while coming back, we got a threatening call from someone. And similar experience when we tried to screen Sanu Kummal's film Chayakadakarante Man Ki Baat, but that was in IDSF, okay? That venue also got cancelled by, someone called to the venue and said to them that this is not allowed. So, sir, I would like to ask you the question that, okay, in the earlier days, maybe the 20 years back, when the social media is not that much, many people we didn't know after, the COVID incident, when Modi asked us to lighten the, Jalana Karna wo bolne ke baad, what happened? Now our neighbor knows what, since on that day in my house I switched on the light. but many people switch off it. So people know that what politics, even the person who is having some 80 years or 90 years old may not be aware about what kind of politics we hold on. But after the COVID, when the people got divided into sectors and the fractions, so the society has been evolved in that way that the people know what kind of politics you are following. So in the earlier days, maybe we can hide ourselves from the community that okay we are. So it was very easy for us, a filmmaker or whoever trying for telling a story. It's very easy. But recently I was shooting my film, and me and Pradap traveled to North India. We avoided certain places because of the safety part, we are not able to go there. And we were also thinking that if going there, something happens to us, then what will happen? Even at least the movie also will not come out. Nothing, it's not bothered about what happened to us, but mostly it's very difficult. So how you compare the situation after now again, you know, all the television channels, even Doordarshan also is used in that way, even radio. You are also a journalist, you have also have experience on television and radio journalism. So all this, mainstream medias or whatever the government-owned media has also been turned. And we were having a period where Anand Padwarthan's movies telecasted or broadcasted by the Doordarshan. But now we cannot even think about a situation like that. So when the media is lying, and it's very difficult for conducting on screening, like off screening, like not an online screening, off screening. And when the algorithms are, controlling the kind of the content what you are planning to. So in that situation, what is the way out, and what the way out, or any idea?
Yeah. So now to come back to your question, two aspects to it. One is about, I'm just summarizing your question. One is about shooting in hostile conditions, in hostile contexts. And second is screening of the work. So let me first just talk about screening of the work. Yes, we know that the task is very uphill for us. Yes, we know that the situation has changed. Algorithms are controlling content online, and offline screenings have become difficult, but perhaps also it's become difficult to attract the kind of large audiences that used to come for offline screenings 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, because people have got everything at the click of a button. They can watch things on their mobile or their tablets and so on and so forth. But these are all, challenges we need to see as real challenges, and we can't lament or bemoan the lack of opportunities the way they used to exist. We need to, evolve and develop newer strategies. What those strategies are, I'm also grappling with them. I'm also trying things out. One thing that I talked about was the fact that I feel that the present generation's attention spans are, shorter and limited. That we perhaps need to look at tailoring content in a manner that deals with that shorter attention span. So, I answered it by saying, in my own work, what many filmmakers see as butchering my own work, but I've actually released standalone sequences of 5 minutes, 7 minutes, 12 minutes, 10 minutes, and several such sequences are available, which get circulated not just online, not just as online links. I know that people are sharing them and forwarding them on WhatsApp because these are shorter videos with limited file sizes. Telegram channels are using it. So, as filmmakers, we can only do things like make our work available, but we also need to trigger a network of, what we would classically call exhibitors and distributors, to enlist our own audiences as our exhibitors and distributors, so that the chain of distribution is far bigger than what we can manage personally through our own networks. And in that sense, as filmmakers, perhaps we need to let go of the baby that we normally try to hold on to. Many filmmakers actually very tightly control the screening of their work. Many filmmakers either don't give you the permission or give only limited permission to a limited set of people for their work to be screened. That needs to just change completely. You know, I mean, if we want to be out there in public, we need to let go of our work as well. You know, so there are various strategies and various ways that all of us need to put our heads about and think through. But these are challenges that we need to deal with. These are real challenges. To come back to the first part of your question about shooting in hostile conditions, you know, I can certainly tell you that Gujarat 2002 was as hostile a terrain to shoot in as anywhere today is. What matters is what I call, you know, I mean, broadly speaking, what I call navigational skills. And that is extremely essential for any filmmaker or any journalist reporting from hostile terrains. You need to be able to navigate through hostility, aggression, physical danger, threat of violence, and so on. And this is a very fine line that really can't be taught. You know, it is something that you develop with experience. So, you know, I have developed experience over many years. You know, before Gujarat, I had shot, as I said, in Punjab at the height of the militancy problem. You know, I mean, just to give you an idea, I once did a 20-day recce trip in Punjab because I was shooting on film cameras those days. So we needed to be very short. So I went on a 20-day recce trip. At the last stage of that recce trip, and this was in 1991, I was in Golden Temple meeting an underground All India Sikh Student Federation's office bearer, you know, who was wanted at that point. And I was taken, you know, to a room, and I sat there, and he came and he shook my hand, and he said, so how was Gurdaspur? And then you went to you know, Amritsar, and then you circled back to Ludhiana, and from there you went to Jalandhar, and then you met that person. And I kind of started laughing, and I said, you know, everything I've done for the last 20 days. So he said to me, do you think it was only the cops and the army and the you know, intelligence that was tapping you and following you? Our people were also following you. So everybody knows where you went. Okay? So, you know, I mean, I had these kind of experiences from 1991. As a sort of light aside, I would say that, you know, when I was being given an award in England for the film, I was in a strange mood that night. So I actually thanked this spy fiction writer called John Le Carre. I don't know whether many of you are familiar with his work. And I said, from John Le Carre, I learned the art of subterfuge, the art of misdirection, the art of dodging tails, the art of misleading spies, and all of that. And just to give you a small example, I knew my phone was tapped. Okay, so on the phone I would discuss a certain schedule at night and definitely not follow that schedule in the morning. So, you know, what would happen is whoever was given the task of following me would be waiting for me in Baroda, whereas I would be in another city altogether. Okay, and then I started noticing the same face or the same pair of shoes. And this is a great tip, you know, I mean, since you're shooting in hostile situations, when you have plainclothes cops following you, always look for shoes and always look for duplicate brand cheap sports shoes, because that's their disguise. So the moment you see, you know, misspelled Puma or misspelled Nike, you immediately understand this is somebody from the special branch. Okay, so I started noticing the same pair of shoes. So I sat back and said, how the hell is this happening? Because I'm misdirecting on the phone. And then I realized that the weakest link was the driver who we had hired in the city. Because they are landing up at his home at night saying, Kal ka kya program hai? And the driver has been told, ki kal subah udhar jana hai. So the driver is merrily sharing it. So then I started misinforming the driver. I would say that 3 दिन का कपड़ा लेके आओ, क्योंकि हम लोग सौराष्ट्र जा रहे हैं. And he would bring 3 days clothes and all that. And I would say, no, we are going to the tribal belt instead. So by the time anybody would cotton on to these plans of mine, we were somewhere else. So I'm saying navigational skills. Deepu has experienced it with me, other people who worked with me. In my unit, there's an iron rule that if I say pack up and leave, everybody has to be in the car in 2 minutes, okay? Because I've got very sharp antenna. So I know that something is about to happen and we need to vamos, we need to instantly go. Because even if we stayed for 5 minutes, either cops or cadre or somebody, something is going to happen. And it's uncanny the way we've been able to avoid hostile situations by minutes, by just minutes. But this is antenna that I've developed after 20 years of working in hostile situations before Final Solution.
But you're one of the people in 90s when I grew up. You were actually commissioned NDTV, okay, to do the work for their first in that way. Like you started the first political discussion, election discussion in Doordarshan. Okay, so today the media is actually traveling in a different direction. I still remember looking up to you from, then later I could work with you, but looking up to you when the days of you are working with Shyam Benegal, then come into the television. Yeah, you actually, several of the people actually, came because you gave them an option. You were one of the most paid person by the Star Networks in South Asia, in that manner. That's when I grew up, actually, looking up to you. So, the question, what he asked, there is an extension to it. You have given direction so much for me, like how I grew up. And so, where do we go right now with all our friends? Several people are in the jail. Okay. Several people are fighting. We cannot speak. We are actually fighting to speak in a country where you actually, in a way, constructed the entire Star TV networks at a point. Okay. For me and all, it's like inspiration. As a person who studied media and cultural studies. So, I want you to actually, where do we walk?
Deepu, that's a long discussion, an ongoing discussion, but I would make two very brief points, and they are, when I quit the corporate sector, broadcasting, and came back to my first love, which is filmmaking, I saw my role as that of somebody, as an interventionist, as somebody who wanted to intervene in the unfolding political situation through my work. And that is exactly how I did my work, that is exactly how I thought about it, how I edited, how I filmed, with a view to intervene. I went through a great period of depression for many years because way back in 2007, I saw Mr. Modi and his politics becoming national, and I saw the inevitability of him becoming the Prime Minister of India. This was way back in 2007, and I went through a long period of depression because there were other works that I've done which I never released countrywide. Films that I have made in Gujarati only and were released in Gujarat alone, on farmer suicides, on caste and Hindutva, and so on. And thousands of copies were made in Gujarati and distributed and screened. So I went through a period of despair, depression, despondency, questioning my own self, questioning my work. And then at some point I was able to get a relative bit of clarity that in these dark times, it's extremely important to be at least the chronicler. I mean, yes, we all want to intervene in the best possible manner. Maybe it is not pragmatic or possible to intervene in the same way that we could 20 years ago. But it is extremely important to remain a chronicler at least, to keep the counter narrative alive. Otherwise, this counter narrative will vanish. Otherwise, you will only have one kind of narrative which is being controlled by them, whether through Godi media or through their own networks or in the way they are changing, curriculum and syllabi and all of that. There's a certain kind of narrative they are pushing, and it is a primary responsibility at this moment to focus first on keeping the counter narrative alive, and then also seeing how much we can push it, how much we can combat, how much we can fight, but not give up in any way and keep the counter narrative going.